One of the several ways that we mark our historic bicentenary here at Virginia Theological Seminary is by creating vehicles that capture the complexity of our history. Hello, I'm Ian Markham, Dean and President of Virginia Theological Seminary. In a series of interviews, we explore the ways in which ministry has been shaped by the moment at which we're called to serve. In our final video of this series, two professors enter into conversation, one in Old Testament, the other in New Testament. They reflect on their journey and the ways in which theological education has changed. Enjoy watching this remarkable conversation between the Reverend Dr. Judy Fentress-Williams and the Reverend Dr. Lloyd Alexander Tony Lewis Jr.
I am Judy Fentress-Williams, and I am Professor of Old Testament here at Virginia Theological Seminary, and it is my pleasure to be here with my esteemed colleague, Tony Lewis.
I am Lloyd Alexander Lewis, commonly known as Tony. I'm the Professor Emeritus. I guess that's the proper title. I'm the Downs Professor Emeritus of New Testament. Was on the faculty here between about the years 2000 and 2012 in the second incarnation, and then in an earlier incarnation between 1978, I believe it was, and 1991. So that was my time and tenure at this school.
I want to start by talking about your name. Because I have a story here. So before I came to VTS, someone that we both know, Miss Ida, gave me a copy of Lift Every Voice and Sing. She said, if you're going to an Episcopal seminary, you need to have this. She didn't give me anything else. She didn't give me a Book of Common Prayer. She didn't give me the hymnal. She gave me Lift Every Voice and Sing. And she told me to find Tony Lewis. So I get here, and I don't see a Tony, I see a Lloyd. And in my mind, I always thought your middle name was Anthony, right? Lloyd Anthony, because we call you Tony. And then I heard the story of your father.
Yes.
Calling you Tony.
Yes. So
that you had a name that was your own.
Yes. All of those things are true. I think my father decided that he did not want to call me Junior. And he certainly didn't want somebody who would be larger than he was to be in one way or another identified with a diminutive. So he just picked a name, and that was the name that I had and that I kept really until I was in my 9th year of high school, in the 9th grade, when for 1 year I was in class with somebody that first year that I went to St. Stephen's, now St. Stephen's, St. Agnes. But there was a young man whose name was Anthony, who was a classmate, and so for 1 year, I became Lloyd, and I enjoyed being Lloyd for 1 year, and then sad to say that young man left St. Stephen's, St. Agnes, so then I went back to being Tony again after that was all over with. But that's the legend of it. It makes for good conversation at parties, if nothing else.
Well, absolutely. But I love this story also because it's the story of your dad making room for you. That he was someone who said, this child needs to have their own space, and I love that part of the story.
Well, he was an unusual person. He was a businessman in Alexandria. He was a funeral director in Alexandria, and was quite a character. At the same time, he had a very, very sort of tender way of being able to do things and helping people and families and things like that to deal with death, I think, realistically. And for all the things that people say negatively about the funeral business, my father probably would be the first person to say to someone, you cannot afford to do all of that. Let's be a little bit more reasonable. And all. I think he was the one who spurred my the emphasis on education that became so important for him and for my mother. Mother was a administrative assistant at Parker Gray School, which was the black high school in Alexandria, and had that position from the year that I started kindergarten until sometime when I was in graduate school. And did that work as part of her commitment, and then kept a rather serious concern for education of young people in the Alexandria area. And that's how I ended up doing this strange educational preparation that I did during the course of my life.
Can we talk about that a little? Because it's
Sure.
remarkable to me. So I'm going to say some things. You can tell me whether I have them right. You were in the first class that desegregated Burgundy Farm Country Day School.
No, there had been other been other black students who had gone to Burgundy School.
Okay.
But I was in a class that was the first, well, I started from kindergarten. And went straight through from the kindergarten through the eighth grade. But 1952 wasn't the most enlightened time in the history of the Commonwealth of Virginia, even in independent schools. So that's how I ended up at Burgundy School, because at that point Burgundy School had made a commitment to having black students as part of the student body.
Okay.
And that's how I got there. The place was, I think, well, I mean, you know this in part from Jacob's experience, but the place was sort of enchanted, and that was one of the things that made it so interesting. I mean, there was whatever else was going on in the world, and then there was living at Burgundy.
That's right.
And all of the things that were really part of the social system in Alexandria, Virginia, the segregated restaurants, the segregated bathrooms, the segregated, I mean, you can list all the things. They just didn't exist there.
That's right.
And the way that the educational philosophy of the school helped to make that type of enchanted situation possible was that it was very, very progressive. It was very, very centered on students. And doing the best that it could to bring the very best out of people. And that, I think, was the recipe that my mother and father looked for when they wanted to get me started in school. So I had a wonderful time.
Now tell the story about how you came to St. Stephen's.
I will. Okay.
It's remarkable to me.
Yeah, the rector of the Episcopal Church that I attended when I was a child was another character. John Davis was a graduate of Bishop Payne, and he got the bee in his bonnet to help to push the church schools in the Diocese of Virginia to become desegregated. I mean, I've never really used the word integrated because I don't know what that word means. I do know what desegregated means, and that's how I ended up going to St. Stephen's with the help of a lot of interesting people. Some of them connected with the seminary, Armstead Booth, whose wife Betty was on the board, I think, of church schools in the either on the St. Stephen's board or the church schools in the Diocese of Virginia. John Frizzell, who was the rector of in Annandale, all weighed in on this in 1961. And they were the ones who helped press the issue. So I took the test for St. Stephen's and for St. Albans, and I got into both. And my friend Jim Gray, who had gone to Burgundy with me, was waitlisted at St. Albans. Well, it was sort of a funny situation because mother and father went to be interviewed by the school. Before I went there, and I've caught bits and pieces from friends of mine who went to St. Stephen's about how St. Stephen's prepared for this 9th grade young black child to come to this school. But mother and father went to be interviewed, and whoever it was who did the interviews said to them, "Now your son, does he play baseball?" And my mother and father said, "No." Does he play basketball? No. Does he play football? No. And then my father said to whoever it was, "My son reads books."
That's why we're here.
That's why we're here. began the time that I was at St. Stephen's. It was an interesting time. It was in the '60s. It was when the first serious waves of the civil rights movement began to go through Alexandria and through Northern Virginia. And I remember as a student listening on the radio when James Meredith desegregated Ole Miss. And it was just a series of things, one after another, that began to change the social system generally in the United States. Going through during the time of the Kennedy administration, when things were really pressing in that way, as John Kennedy began to be aware of the fact that this was a serious matter that needed to be dealt with, and the Johnson administration and the beginning of the press for the Civil Rights Act that was passed during the time that Lyndon Johnson was there. But I wanted to go to a church school, and that's part of what St. Stephen's provided, very, very clear. It taught me a lot of things. It was a wonderful education, a good follow-up to Burgundy, a lot more structure than Burgundy certainly was. I didn't mind wearing a coat and tie every day to go to school. And part of my training when I was there was with 3 or 4 really wonderful teachers in classics in Latin, and that's how I got the classics bug. And then when I got the degree, I got the diploma from Virginia, from St. Stephen's, which is on my wall right now. It's hanging on my wall. Then I went off to be an undergraduate major in classics at Trinity in Hartford. And that's how I ended up in Hartford and in the proximity of the McKinneys, our friends. Ida and Walter, yeah. Ida and Walter and the kids. Yeah. So that's sort of it in a nutshell about the education. But I guess it's one of those things that and you may want to share some things about what your experience was with your parents. My parents were Shrivers, and very seriously so. Yeah. And wanted to see that their only child, because I was their only child, had all of the benefits of a good education, because education was the means of survival. That's right.
No, that would have been a common thing with my parents. My dad was a truck driver. And my mom was the one who had the college education. And so we were in a house where there was lots of music, lots of reading. They had these things called Golden Legacy comic books that had stories of famous African Americans that we would read. And my parents wanted us to get the education. So my Christian school was evangelical. And so very, very solid basics. A lot of reading, a lot of writing, a lot of arithmetic. Science, not as strong, but we had a course in Bible. So you had Bible every year, just like you had all of your other courses. And I tell folks I learned more about the Bible in elementary school than I learned in seminary, because we had it all the time. So yeah, it was an interesting experience because it took a while for me. My sisters and I were a few in a handful of African American students in an evangelical school where racism was mixed up in the religion. So part of the work was kind of separating some of that out. And so that was an important part of my formation, for better or for worse, was to one day recognize, wait a minute, there's something about this that's not right. And I'm not sure what it is yet, but to kind of remain alert to figure out what parts of what I was experiencing actually belonged to my faith tradition, and what parts didn't have to be a part of that. Yeah, but I got the clear message from my parents: education is the way.
Sure. Yeah. Well, that's a common experience, of course. I think one of the things that and I won't belabor the St. Stephen's thing too much, but Barbara Hall, who used to teach here at one point, used to talk about the fact that that people who have grown up in what would be called a minority culture fast learn to be amphibious, and that's her famous word for it.
Yeah.
And it's the fact that that you can code switch, you can move back and forth very, very easily.
Yes.
But you always know who you are.
Yes.
And you have something that grounds you in who you are. So since I went to high school and later on when I went to seminary in Alexandria, the Alexandria community was the community I grew up in and that I moved back and forth within.
Yes.
So they were the people, especially the elderly people, were the ones who were my ground. I mean, they taught me.
Yes.
And they were the ones who, in addition to whatever I was learning there about Western civilization and declining Latin nouns, they were the ones who
Absolutely, absolutely. And on that note, not because of an age difference, but because of presence, you were that person here for me. Someone who was deeply grounded, formed by the Episcopal tradition, so that I could come to you with any question and not feel like a complete idiot. But you also, as I've said to you before, were the keeper of my sanity. Someone who, could just come, sit in your space and know, okay, I remember who I am now. And then go back out and do whatever it was that needed to be done. So I want you to know how grateful I am.
Well, I could no doubt say the same thing, Judy, because it was, being the only Black faculty member at Virginia, it was a different type of experience. And when there was company, when there was a company that was compatible, it was a great gift. And that was something that had nothing at all to do with a person's own tradition. But just the fact that there were people, there was at least one person here with whom there was a common bond, just because of the fact that we'd struggled with things in common in our own spaces and in our own places.
That's right.
And that did make a difference. It really did.
Even though you constantly tried to take students from Hebrew into Greek, in spite of that.
Well, that whole thing about what language does God speak in heaven, or which language does God go to church with in heaven, and things like that.
Clearly couldn't be Greek.
Definitely couldn't be Hebrew.
Well, I have it on good authority that Jesus spoke in King James English, and so God must have done the same.
Well, there it is. I mean, that's a situation. When in doubt, go back to the KJV. It doesn't hurt.
Oh, yeah.
What made you want to leave the joys of Hartford, Connecticut, to come to the Episcopal Seminary in Virginia?
Well, that was primarily the doing of Ellen Davis.
Okay.
So Ellen was my former professor at Yale. She lived in the house I currently live in, and unbeknownst to me, I was sending drafts of my dissertation to 3737 Seminary Road, never thinking I would end up living here. There. Ellen called me and said, I want you to consider this position. I was considering another position at the time, and when you come to an interview and you don't think you don't know what you're getting into, sometimes you're just really, really comfortable, and I was very comfortable. I wasn't nervous at all. Martha Horn was lovely. And so as things worked out, I had to make a decision between coming here and going to this other place. And I got a call from Bill Stafford, who was then Dean of the Faculty, who in his very wise way said, here are the things this place is and here are the things that it is not. But I think you could have a wonderful time as a teacher here. And after I made the decision to come here, Ellen then circled back around and said, promise me you will stay for at least 3 years. So I think I have fulfilled that. I've been here 19. It has been a wonderful place for my family. As you mentioned, our son Jacob followed in your footsteps. He went to Burgundy Farm Country Day School, and we loved it. And then he transitioned to St. Stephen's in 8th grade. So he went through 7th and then came to St. Stephen's and graduated from St. Stephen's. He was not a classics major. He's biochemistry, and I don't know that there's a call on his life, but he's had a wonderful experience. My kids, Samantha went to MacArthur right down the road, and then she went to National Cathedral School, and then came back to TC. So they had wonderful friends, a diverse group of friends. Some of Samantha's friends actually came to my Hebrew class in the summer and would read Torah for us. So it was great for them, a great community. There's a challenge for kids because they make friends with families who are only here for a short period of time. So after a couple of years, they got hip to that and said, okay, yeah, our friends are going to be in the community. But I loved it for our family. Kevin was able to practice in Maryland. So I think that was good for the most part. It is always a challenge, I think, with a young family to protect them from some of the changes that happen on campus, but I think we did pretty well there. So yeah, I've loved teaching here. I've loved teaching Bible. I've loved teaching Hebrew. And that is, I think, my primary purpose. I've loved being able to create safe space for all of our students, but particularly our students of color, for them to know they could come to our home and just be, they could go to your house and just relax, and that was safe haven. And I've enjoyed that. And I have to say, I think we've had a pretty spectacular Bible department. Wonderful, all up until very recently, educated at Yale, but different in our approaches and perspectives. And it has been a real joy to have a department.
Yes, I absolutely agree.
Yeah.
Wonderful colleagues. I mean, that's one of the things that I really miss being off campus. I kid people and say that my retirement regimen has been blessed with the fact that I am close enough to the seminary that I can use the library, but far enough from it so that I don't get involved in seminary politics. Which
no more faculty meetings.
No faculty meetings at all. The decision, I guess, the decision to retire.
Yeah.
When do you say stop? Well, truth be known, I mean, you never really do. Teaching and priesting and all of those things are until I go over the hill to my little place over there that's waiting for me. And all, it goes on forever. And I suppose these are the words that I'd want to use. That I felt comfortable leaving teaching Scripture because of the people who were here who were teaching Scripture.
Yeah.
It's not as if that what happened when I retired would leave a great void in one sense, because that was constantly being filled by the next generation of teachers and scholars that were here. So I felt comfortable about being able to do it and did so with no regrets. It was, of course, that sort of transition time. So there were, in some ways, there were things that drew me onto this campus that normally would not have happened. There was that sort of in-between time of getting this chapel finished, and the investment that I have in and had in the worship life of this place that kept me around for a while. There were times when John or Kathy needed somebody else to teach baby Greek, and the like, or to do part of a course that they were teaching, and do that. So I still keep, I guess, one oar in the lake, and still am able to do that. no regrets. I mean, it's been fun to be on the outside and just sort of call you up and say, Panera's let's call. Let's go get a cup of coffee and talk about what's going on, because the desire is not to leave friends.
Thank you so much for being my friend.
Well, the same.
It's so funny. I was listening to something on YouTube yesterday. Every now and then I just go in to see what random church people are saying, and this man was making this argument that had so little to do with scripture that I thought, who monitors this? You know, there's this whole universe where people are kind of in there doing whatever they want to do. And it's one of the things that made me realize how important the work we do here really is, to make sure people have some kind of framework for thinking about things that have to do with God.
I can tell you that there are lots of times when I talked to students when I was here.
Yeah.
And part of the conversation, as the conversation sort of went on, and as the conversation got deeper and deeper, I was aware of the fact that that when I was talking to students, I was talking Bible to them, and thinking, you know, it's not so much just what would Jesus do, but how thinking about the world in the way, let's say that St. Paul would think about the world. What does that do to make me effective within a congregation, when I have to be a leader in the congregation, but when I also have to be a person who, by that leadership, has something to give to other people.
Yeah.
And that's sort of living in a biblical world.
So what do you think the Episcopal Church still needs to learn?
Well, it doesn't hurt with all the learning that the Episcopal Church has a heart, and that the heart is something that people might fruitfully listen to, and let that inform the way that they do this. Because I mean, obviously, this is not just the type of intellectual game that gets played in junior common rooms inside of a university. Being informed, yes. I mean, the idea, what is sort of a devout and learned clergy, is an ideal to which the Episcopal Church, I think, aspires. But then you have to talk to people.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know whether when you were in graduate school, Judy, if you ever met Abraham Mallory.
Oh God. Yes.
Well, that takes care of that. who was one of the professors of the New Testament at Yale, and who was, to me, not only formidable but frightening. But Mallory used to talk to graduate students when he wasn't sort of helping them to sort of think into the what was going on in the first century, and talk about preaching and things of that nature. He would always say to people, when you go to write a sermon, you do your work at home. Wow. But you don't take your work and put it on display in the pulpit. He said, people don't want to see what you do in the potting shed. They want to see the flowers. And I suppose it was one of the most dramatic remedies that ever I heard issued from a very brilliant man to people who preach and says the Greek says, the Hebrew says, or something of that nature. But sure, okay, you know that. But what does it mean? Where do you go? Where do you go from there?
That's right.
And that's the thing that people hunger for.
Yeah.
They could care less about a hith pael.
That's right. Yeah. But speaking of hith pael,
we're back to Hebrew.
My Abraham Malherbe story. So I never had him as an instructor. I had Lee Keck for New Testament. But whenever that man would encounter me on the stairwell, in the elevator, he would just start a paradigm. He would say, Yiktol. And then look at me and expect me to complete it. And so and he would just, whatever it was. And so that's my relationship with this man, is that somehow he knew I was studying Hebrew. And whenever he ran into me, he would start the paradigm and look at me and expect me to complete it.
Formidable.
Yeah. It's like, what are the rules here? I didn't know.
Judy, what was your experience of Yale?
When I look back on it now, I had some of the greatest instructors. Yeah. It was the golden age. I had Letty Russell teaching me about the hermeneutical circle. I had no idea how valuable that was. Margaret Farley, Peter Hawkins, who I'm in love with to this day. I adore him. Brevard Childs, Ellen Davis was there. David Kelsey. So some amazing, amazing people. As I said, Lee Keck, Sue Garrett was there. And so I had exceptional teachers and great training in the classroom.
Yes.
Didn't have the kind of formation for religious leadership per se, but at that point I wasn't seeking ordination.
Sure.
So I loved that. I loved getting to know the churches in the New Haven area. There were quite a variety there, and I loved all of that. I loved the libraries, and I lived off campus, so my seminary experience was fairly uneventful. Participated in the Yale Black Seminarians and loved that work as well. I think that's when I met Renita Weems for the first time. She came to give a lecture for us. And then I remember when Bob Wilson pulled me aside and asked me if I'd ever consider doing doctoral work.
Yes.
And said, now, deciding to do doctoral work is deciding not to do other things.
Yes. Oh, goodness gracious.
Yeah, right? That was wonderful advice. And so even though I applied to other schools and got into other schools, I thought, I know these people. Good, bad, and otherwise. And so I decided to stay at Yale, and that was a good decision as far as I can tell. Yeah.
I guess I can say much the same thing. I learned a whole lot about myself in the process of doing graduate education, but I was blessed. Same thing, incredible teachers.
Yeah.
And and teachers who would not put up with half-baked things, and even when you tried to offer them, they would identify it as such and make a comment. But it prepared me for what I wanted to do as because at that point I was already ordained, had been for 2 years, and prepared me for being able to do work with a specific focus on doing teaching inside of a theological seminary, and much the same as your experience with Bob Wilson. Mine was with Cecil Woods, who was then dean of the seminary, and who was of this seminary, and who was sort of the very epitome of Tennessee Southern gentlemen, and who did the same thing, who took me aside and said, you've majored in classics, the work you've done in New Testament here, most of which I did with Dick Reed, who was in many ways my fodder doctor. But you've done well with that and things like that. Have you considered it? And by the way, your seminary will make it possible if you do consider it. And it was partially the outgrowth of an event that took place on campus at one point, in which black clergy were sort of invited to be here, sort of turn the tables on what happened, and said, we have nothing to say, you have to do your own homework. And there was the conference.
That's great.
And part of the outgrowth of it was when I was a student was the seminary saying that it would behoove this place, if it wants black faculty members, to grow them. And that's part of what Cecil did, and it's the reason that I finally got my graduate work done, and then began to do the teaching that I did. I mean, that was a different world when I was in seminary. There were 3 black students that entered the year that I did, which was a bumper crop at that point, because the enrollment sort of was at a maximum during the 50s and 60s, early 60s, then shrunk. So that when the 3 of us who were admitted got here, we were something of a event.
So who were the other 2?
Joe Forrester was one, and he is deceased. Okay. Percy Brown was the other student with me, and Percy really, in many ways, was more than a brother for me while I was here. Joe only was here for a few years, and then he finished it at EDS. Okay. But Percy saw it through until graduate. He was the youngest person in our class. Wow. And all. So I mean, that's sort of what it was. Yeah. What it was like, and then it was in the middle of anti-war stuff. It was in the middle of serious things being done about addressing racism. This was 1969, 1970, and here we are. I mean, the world hasn't completely turned over for the good yet.
That's right. So when I came here in 2002, my family was on campus, walking on campus, and we met Paula Green. Oh. Well, first we met Misha. You met Misha. And then she took us to her mother. And then when we met Paula, Paula said, "You've met 50% of the black students on campus."
No, there you
are. The other person was Anne-Marie Jeffries. But then a few years later, we had another kind of bumper crop. It went up and down. So that's amazing.
We keep an eye open and ears open. And part of our ministry, I think, has always been to be there to intervene for students, to be able to encourage them and to make things happen, because it can be a lonely place.
Yes, and misunderstandings can happen. And sometimes we have students who, for any number of reasons, but some of them are cultural, don't necessarily feel that they have permission to stand up for themselves, depending on what happens and who's involved. So it's nice to know that there are folks here to whom you can speak.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And the more the better, since no one person can be all to everyone.
That's right. That's nice. Absolutely right.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask you a little bit about Greek. I really do. Because, no, I'll tell you why.
Because, why would you do something like that?
I think one of the things I really love about VTS is that it still requires the learning of biblical languages, that it recognizes the importance of this. And you are famous as a Greek instructor. I've heard students say things like, I learned more about the English language in learning Greek than I've known my entire life, which is wonderful. So that they're really kind of making the connections not only to learning a language, but how language works. Their own. And so I wonder...
Surprise, surprise.
Right? Oh, is that what that was? So I wonder what one of your favorite things about teaching Greek. What do you love about that?
I think the thing that I really, besides being a ham, because there's no way that I think I could ever teach a language without being something of a ham. And it's one of the reasons that I have very profound respect for you and Stephen and Kathy and John, that you all have survived teaching languages during this pandemic. I have no idea how I would have had been able to sort of switch doing teaching a language the way that I have. But I think the thing that I delight in is seeing the aha moment in people's eyes when all of a sudden, and you can watch it in somebody's face when you're teaching them. All of a sudden, the pieces come together, and people are able to take whatever this language is, and own it, and say, I can talk with this, I can converse with this, and I can be in dialogue with this set of symbols, and they can say something to me that otherwise would get lost. I mean, we have I will not mention the student's name, but we have a common child here.
Yes, we do.
And this student who also is a character.
Yes.
This student. I remember when he began to learn Greek, and he just got set on fire by it. He began to discover things in the biblical text that he could not discover just by using the symbols of English, and he just it was incredible. I had a teacher when I was in grade school at Burgundy School, who was very deeply interested in the natural sciences, and he used to say, when I was connected with him in another endeavor and was doing some teaching, he said, "Never rob a student of the discovery of something that you may know, but that they are encountering for the first time."
That's lovely.
And that, I think, is the thing about that I found about doing language teaching that I really love.
Yeah.
So how did you do that during the pandemic?
Well, I didn't.
Oh, Stephen did it. Okay.
Stephen did it, and that was perfect, actually, because Stephen loves all things technical, and John got a smart board and figured out how to do it. So Stephen and John did it, and we will probably be able to accommodate some students from other institutions
sure.
going forward with that. But I love what you said about that moment of discovery in languages for our students. And this whole, this is someone who's learned so many languages. Every language you learn opens up your brain a little bit more,
sure.
right? So you begin to see all the subtleties and possibilities, that it's not just what's before us, but it's this invitation to explore more. And so I know there are generations of students who are grateful for that opportunity to see more. Yeah.
It really does make a difference. And again, I'm in one sense, I'm sort of embarrassed that I have that little piece of the teaching experience that I just covet, because I just love doing it, and I've missed it during the years that I've been more retired than not. But having said that it's sort of in one sense an embarrassment, it's sort of like that idea. It's a good embarrassment.
It is.
and I'm thankful for it.
Yeah. It's where they keep the good stuff. It's this one of those moments where you realize this really is where it's at. Sure. When students figure it out and they come running to you to tell you this thing that they've discovered. Or I often say to students in the first year, my goal is to have you reading like a first grader. I don't need you to read like a grown-up, but a first grader can make sense out of something.
But that you have some common ground with the language experience. Learning languages always has been a time when you can see how people either resist the idea of doing it a way other than their way.
That's right.
Or that they take the plunge.
That's right.
And when they take the plunge, they find something that they wouldn't have found otherwise. I mean, Donald Coggan, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, used to say that he, because he taught scripture, and he said, it's always fun. You go in, you dive into concordance, and you find God. and that's sort of what that experience can be.
So maybe we should rename it Code Switching 101.
Code Switching 101. Baby code switching.
I still have my baby Greek shirt, so every now and then I will.
I still have my baby Hebrew shirt.
Do you?
Sure.
That's good.
I proudly.
I'm glad it made the cut with downsizing.
And no, there's some things that you just cannot surrender.
So as we think about this institution's bicentennial and all the hoopla that comes along with that, I wonder what you want for the future, or what you think the right direction for this institution would be on the other side of this bicentennial.
Well, I think that if the school sees the bicentennial not as a culmination, not as an end point, but as a beginning point, then it will be fine. It's been asking some very serious questions.
That's right.
About itself, about its history.
Yeah.
And the temptation's always there, Judy, to sort of say that well, we've sort of dealt with whatever it is, and here's the stopping point for dealing with whatever it is, and there, see, we paid our dues and blah 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 blah.
Yeah.
But if the school really does see things like this whole question about the school's impact upon the community that surrounded it way back when, and that whatever's done with the with finding a way to aid to address it honestly, and then beyond addressing it honestly, to look for what the next step really should be, with the idea that the next step, there is no sort of closure that's there,
Right.
but rather what this is the opening up of a new set of possibilities. Then I think the bicentennial will indeed be worth whatever it is. I mean, you think about the idea that people throw a big party, and once the party's over with, that's all. Well, no, there's work to be done, and the work is going to be there. One of the families that was part of the experience of the seminary's history is the Wanzer family, and I grew up in Alexandria with Wanzers, and my barber is a Wanzer, and he and I have had some conversation at the times that I've gone to get my haircut about what all this means, and what it means to have the seminaries sort of make a type of outreach with an idea that some people will say, thank you very much for your money, bye. Some people will not engage because the experience was such a bitter thing, and then some people will want to be cooperatively involved in looking for how the seminary might be in a type of partnership with the community, in a way that was, because there literally were people in Alexandria who had no idea that this place was here, and I mean, here it was, so I mean, that really is the school, and I mean, I'm thankful for the school's courage. I'm thankful for the school's thoughtfulness about wanting to do this, wanting to do it in a way that's done responsibly and done with a sense of care for what's being done. But nonetheless, that's a beginning. And that will be one of the great contributions that can grow out of what this might be.
And I think that some of the most important work for this institution is to define and redefine what the needs of the church are. Primarily the needs of the Episcopal Church, acknowledging that the Episcopal Church doesn't exist in a vacuum and we need to be aware of other traditions. Even though this institution honors, recognizes, and supports one, to be aware that there are other things in the world. I think those are the challenges before us. All the while we are in a world where I think the younger generation is not going to be so patient while we figure out what we're doing. No. They're not. So I think we need to do it with some mindfulness and with a quickness.
Absolutely agree.